if you're going to be a good leader and if you're going to make good decisions, then you need to find your place in a larger story. And by that, I don't mean that you need to find yourself an organization to work within or submit yourself to. I mean that you need to do two things. First, you need to recognize the reality that none of us are truly main characters. Or if we are, it's only for a chapter or two. We are all already part of a larger story, whether or not we want to admit or acknowledge that. The second thing that you need to do is you need to find your why. Why are you doing what you're doing, making the decisions that you're making? What is your motivation and reason? And that comes back to influence any decision you might make in your organization or for your team or anything that you do, really. I was reminded of this while catching up on some blogs and newsletters from Alicia McKay. She's a strategist in New Zealand who I've been following for several years. And she's writing a lot more these days, which is wonderful. And I was several behind, so I was catching up. And she had this observation in one of her newsletters from the last couple of weeks. She had written thousands of words, but she found a sentence from another person that, of course, I did not memorize, and I can't bring up on my phone while I'm walking through this field without massively interrupting the video. But effectively, that's what it said. It said, you need to find your place in a larger story in order to make better decisions. And this is something I have experienced and feel deeply, and I've talked a little bit about. I think there are a lot of decisions being made and that have been made for decades based on a spreadsheet, a budget, a P&L. And there are realities to the world that we all need to be conscious of. If your company doesn't have the money to pay people, that is what it is, right? Sometimes you got to make cuts. But too often, we outsource our decision making to poorly designed systems, to these spreadsheets, and increasingly these days to AI and LLMs, which have been trained on a corpus of data with a particular worldview. And that worldview may not be the right one for making decisions in your business, and it may not actually reflect your worldview. Maybe you don't know what your worldview is. I don't know. My point with all this is you got to do the work of figuring out what matters to you and what you're going to base your decisions on. And you got to do that before really making those decisions. If you're going to be a good leader, if you're going to be the one with the authority to decide, you got to figure out what your story, your motivation is. For me, I describe myself as a Christian contractualist. Contractualism is a system of ethics, comes from a fellow named Scanlon, who wrote the book, What We Owe to Each Other. And in it, Scanlon posits that any action we take, any decision we make, needs to be justifiable to a reasonable person. And hearkening back to the title, I think a lot about, what do I owe other people? What do I owe the members of my team? And I describe my own ethical system as Christian contractualism because I think about this within the greater context of, what do I owe to God? Someone in exchange for what God has provided me. There is a contract between me and God. And the Christian Bible, and particularly the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as Christians call it, is filled with this language of covenant and contract. And whether you're Christian or not, it really doesn't matter. My point here is I have my story. I have my disciplines. I have my values. They provide context for the decisions that I make. They give all of my decisions an internal consistency to them. They help me make better decisions. And that's what you need to be a good leader. Jim Collins found in writing I don't remember which of his books it was. I think it was the one about luck. I can't remember the title. It was one of the more recent ones. But he found that it didn't necessarily matter for a company in terms of its success during times of chaos. It didn't matter what the company's values were. What mattered was, did they have values and did they adhere to them with discipline? And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. In order to be a good leader, you need to have a set of values. You need to have a story better, greater than yourself. You need to have a why that exists outside yourself that you can adhere to. And if you do that, you will be better. So your work is to figure out what that is, to codify it, to write it down, to dwell and meditate on it, to steep yourself in it and figure out that, to take that step zero, right? As I keep calling it, that becoming. When you figure that out, everything else gets easier and you make better decisions. Whatever that foundation is, you just got to have a foundation.